spent careers defining and participating in this process of public history, whether it's in creating museum exhibitions, creating works of public art, writing literature, or in public schooling, or working with teachers and in curriculum development, or in the creation of monuments and memorialization, or in interpreting historic sites, and so on. Public history is a booming, growing field and problem all over the world. And one of its most important subjects, one of its most difficult and vexing subjects in the past decade or two has, of course, been this story, slavery, and its end, and its legacies. I want to just suggest at the outset a set of working questions. And these are just questions I've dreamed up, and there could be 7 or 8 others that are already on your mind that I haven't come up with. And these are just working questions. Why slavery? Why the slave trade? And why now? How is this question similar or different from Liverpool to Charleston, South Carolina, Bristol, Rhode Island, Amsterdam, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Sierra Leone, Senegal, New York, London, or Accra? Do we ask different questions in different places? 2. How do our diverse experiences, disciplines, and artistic and professional interests shape what we ask about this particular past? 3. What is the relationship? This came up last night quite vividly. What is the relationship between healing and justice from our various perspectives on this problem or any problem of historical memory? 4. What is the politics that either drives or thwarts our efforts now to tell the story of slavery, the trade, or its abolition? Is this ultimately a problem of the politics of memory, and who gets to tell it, and who gets to fund it, and who gets to control it? 5. What is the power of place in this story, and of pilgrimage to places? 6. How do we define or comprehend the relationship between our intellectual, and this came up last time too, our intellectual and our moral sensibilities when dealing with this story? Do they conflict? Do they simply inform one another? Does one dominate the other? Do we have to suppress one to do the other? 7. For practitioners of the past, is it always the sovereign present that dominates the public memory of slavery? Is it the present that this is really about, no matter where we do it or how we do it? And 8, I don't know why I came up with 8, but the last one is a very American question. I won't apologize for it, but others can ask it from their own perspective. Will Americans ever overcome their sense of innocence and their expectations of progress and develop a genuine sense of tragedy? Have they? Are they? Can they? I just thought I could get away with that since this is the United States. I want to say also at the outset that David Bryan Davis, the founder of this center, and maybe still our greatest living historian of this problem, is as usual not retired. He's on the road doing a book tour. And that's why he's not here this weekend. Last time we did our conference, he was on the road giving the Tanner lectures at Stanford, and so on. He's allegedly retired, but it's not true. And just the last couple notes. John Fleming brought up last night the Cincinnati Freedom Center, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, one of the major museums about the history of slavery and its abolition, has come into existence in recent years. At one of those many, many, many meetings over the years of the creation of that center, in some in this room were at this meeting. John asked each of us historians on a Saturday morning for about 3 hours to sit at tables of about 6 members of their board of trustees. And at my table, I had the chief architect of the building, I had a school superintendent, I had prominent civil rights lawyers, I had a famous artist. I was really intimidated. I'm going to run a little seminar with all these smart, successful people, and our job was to get them talking about why this center should be built. And we went around and around, and we heard all sorts of variations on why we were doing what we were doing. And to a person, virtually every one of them said, particularly to me as the historian, we want this to be a redemptive story. We want to bring our children here. We want our children to walk out of here feeling better. And whoa, I was doing my best. I was just sort of directing traffic, but there was one person at our table, and it was Fred Shuttlesworth, Baptist minister, Reverend Shuttlesworth, famous leader of SCLC in Birmingham, Alabama during the Civil Rights Movement, who put his neck on the line over and over and over, was nearly killed several times. He just sat silently through all of this. He hadn't said anything. He lives in Cincinnati, where he lived then in Cincinnati. And finally, it was my job, Reverend Shuttlesworth, what do you think? And he looked all these people in the eye and he said simply, if you don't tell it like it was, it can never be as it ought to be. If you don't tell it like it, and he repeated himself, if you don't tell it like it was, it can never be as it ought to be. And there was silence. Nobody said anything. I started to try to get the discussion going again, but I never forgot that sentence. And then he didn't say much more the rest of the meeting. But it was a historical participant's experience, clearly, that was coming out of him that morning. And he was frankly annoyed, I think, by all of this expectation that a museum ought just heal people. Now, maybe it can. And maybe what we do here today and tomorrow can do a little of that work. And what we do in our classes, and what we do when we make films, and what we do when we create exhibitions can do some of that work. But it is useful, I think, to have a bracing sense of reserve about just what we can accomplish or can't. But of course, having said that, we have to keep trying. Now, one last little mundane matter before I introduce our keynote. We structured this conference around panels. Panels, with a capital P. Not formal, scholarly, long academic papers. You'll note there are as many as 4 people in most of these panels. Everyone has been asked through numerous emails and communications to speak for 10 to 15 minutes. I will be a draconian moderator, as will Laurent Dubois, who's going to moderate the Caribbean session, and Peter Allman, who's going to moderate the film session tomorrow. The purpose of which, of course, is to bring some of the smartest people in the world to deal with this together on panels, to speak about what they actually do, and then to open it up to our discussion, because I know, believe me, I know, there are many of you in this audience who do this every day, in the field of journalism, and as curators, as public historians of all kinds. And we want this to be a public conversation, messy as it might get, informative as it might get. 10 to 15 minutes.
Not me, though.
Not you, the keynote. You get a pass.
I'll go home.
The keynote gets a pass. Lonnie Bunch is one of the great museum leaders in the United States. He grew up in Newark, New Jersey, which he shares with Jim Horton. Oh, is he a suburbanite? Is he really a suburbanite?
So you out me already.
Claims he's from Newark. Anyway, you two work this out. Well, I would say I'm from Flint, Michigan, and Michael Moore is from Flint, but he really grew up in a suburb. He's a suburbanite. Anyway, Lonnie was educated both undergraduate and graduate, worked at American University, In Washington, D.C., he first started working for the Smithsonian Institution in Washington in the late 1970s at the Air and Space Museum, where he worked on, among other projects, the story of African Americans in aviation. His first curatorial job was in Los Angeles at the California Afro-American Museum, where he worked throughout most of the 1980s.
My kids.
Well, you got to be there to know it. He did exhibitions there on subjects like Black Olympians and Black Angelinos. In the 1990s, he went to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, where he became Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs from 1994 to 2000. He led the team that created the permanent exhibit at the Smithsonian on called the American Presidency, a Glorious Burden. And then he moved to Chicago, where he became president from 2001 to 2005 of the Chicago Historical Society, one of the great urban historical institutions in the United States, one of the oldest. And then he just moved recently back to Washington to be the founding director of the new Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, which, as probably everyone knows, is now planned for a 5-acre site right on the National Mall, adjacent to between the Washington Monument and the National Museum of American History. And as many of you may remember, this was a very big deal that the African American Museum would get such a prominent position on the mall. In fact, it was just last night again on National Public Radio. There was yet another story about what's getting on the mall and what's not, the Eisenhower Memorial, etc., on America's front lawn or back lawn or most sacred space or whatever one wants to call it. From fundraising to curatorial design to the creation of history for the broadest possible publics, and on this question of the politics of memory in American museums, there are few better spokespersons than Lonnie Bunch, and hence, as our curator, we welcome Lonnie Bunch.
And I was born in Newark, unlike Bob. Let me begin with a story. Early in my career at the Smithsonian, I wanted to do a major exhibition on history of 19th century America. And a major part of that had to look at slavery. And so we struggled very hard, one, working through the politics of the Smithsonian because there was concern that we shouldn't do a major exhibition on slavery. But secondly, we wanted to try to tell it through a different kinds of lens. So I traveled around the country. So I spent a lot of time in Texas looking at cotton plantations, Louisiana looking at sugar plantations. And then I found the plantation. It was the Friendfield Rice Plantation above Georgetown, South Carolina, the old Waccamaw Neck. And as I went down this road past what they called a pond, what I called a swamp, but as I went down this road, suddenly I turned left, and there was this wonderfully extant slave street of 8 cabins still standing, few modified as tenant farmers, but some still standing, much like it was 1850. And next to one of the cabins was a man named Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson was 92 years old, and he had lived in that slave cabin with his slave grandmother. So you could imagine, this is the holy grail for a historian. So I just followed Mr. Johnson around. He walked me to the front of the cabin, and he talked about how his grandmother and the slaves took that broom to do the hard sweep, to get that ground hard as concrete so there'd be no grass, no vermin, so that the slaves could extend their living space out to the front of the cabin. Then we walked to one side of the cabin, and he talked about the role the children played in mining the chimney and watching to make sure it didn't catch on fire. And then we went to the back of the cabin, and he talked for almost an hour about the challenge of growing crops to supplement supposedly what the master gave them, but the desire in the back for his grandmother to have a greater control over who she was by what she grew. And then we went, or rather I went to the foresight. He wouldn't come. I said, Mr. Johnson, what happened over here? He said, boy, I'm not going over there. I said, okay. I kept asking him. I did what all good Washingtonians do. I said, come on, I came all the way down from D.C., give me a break. He said, I'm not going over there. Finally, we walked through the cabin again, and he talked powerfully about this question of privacy and the role of the loft. But I kept going back to that fourth side. And finally, I went to that side again and said, Mr. Johnson, please come over here. He said, there's no way. Finally, I said, Mr. Johnson, why not? He said, because there are rattlesnakes over there. Now, being from Newark, after I stopped running, I asked Mr. Johnson, I said, Mr. Johnson, why didn't you tell me? And he said, son, everybody used to remember. They used to remember that spot. They used to remember. But he said, now, people seem to remember just what they want, not what they need. And in some ways, all of us should be haunted by Mr. Johnson's call to remember, and especially those that work in museums. I would argue that there has been so much work in the academy that really helps people to remember slavery and its impact. The study and interpretation of slavery in the academy, as you know, has been dramatic and exciting over the last several decades. All these new methodologies, new inquiries, creative mining of sources and insights have contributed mightily to what we know about slavery. And this work has really begun in more than a trickle. It's really begun a flood to shape those who labor in the field of public history. In some way, the interpretation of slavery in American museums has also changed dramatically. Some would argue that gone are the days when most historic houses, when most plantations and their museums celebrated the elite, but rarely mentioned the slave. Some would argue, and get it, not me, but some would argue that gone are the days when these institutions celebrated simply the product, not those who produced the product. And gone are the days when plantation museums and museums throughout the North and the South saw themselves as places to glorify antebellum opulence, or when the tour of most of the museums that many of us went on early in our careers were occasionally focused on the role of the servant. And yet, it wasn't that long ago, not more than 2 or 3 years ago, when I went on a tour of the Hermitage Plantation, Andrew Jackson's home in Tennessee. And this is a place that has done innovative work on the story of slavery. And the archaeological research is brilliant. But somehow that didn't get translated to the docent. So as the docent took me on the tour, she wanted to make sure the one thing I saw was that buried at the foot of Andrew Jackson's grave was his loyal retainer, Alfred. She thought that was really important for me. And she talked, I think, very passionately about this symbolizes a relationship that sometimes people don't understand. I, of course, was struck by the notion that poor Alfred was meant to serve Andrew through all eternity. But in some ways, that notion of how to make sure what we know is translated to the general public through those that do most of the work is an interesting conundrum. But I would argue that you could make a strong argument that based on the changes in museums, gone are the days when there aren't substantive interpretive exhibitions on slavery that are based on the paucity of objects or the lack of research, or gone are the days when many museum directors and curators bemoan the fact that there wasn't the kind of scholarship to help to create these important exhibitions. I would argue that some people have made a strong argument that the days when the public also expressed less interest in slavery are also gone. And you could look at the array of wonderful things that have happened in museums in recent years to believe that. You could look at the changes in Monticello, where plantations like Monticello and Mount Vernon now tell the story of the slave, now tell the story of the enslaved on Mulberry Row. Of course, some would make an argument that Monticello was really changed by the Sally Hemings story, less than by some of the research, but it's really shaped the way the public sees these institutions. And places like Mount Vernon, who's gotten all this interesting publicity about how it's interpreted George Washington, has made a major look at how it wants to reinterpret slavery. And plantations from Drayton Hall to others throughout the United States begin to find new ways to interpret slavery. And I would argue, however, that most plantations still fail us because they really do not do what I think the best plantation interpretation in America does, and that's the Somerset Plantation in North Carolina. A plantation that says, if you want to understand plantation life, begin with the enslaved, begin in the fields. And so even the tours of Somerset begin at the heart of the plantation, in the fields. And only at the end of the tour do you get to the house, and only is the house then seen through the lens of labor, of the enslaved. But very few plantations do what Somerset does. In some ways, Somerset is this wonderful beacon of what is possible on plantations. I think it demonstrates the transformative power of history when the past is made meaningful and useful, because the African American community around Somerset sees this not simply as a plantation about yesterday, but as a place where memories of today are also constructed by breaking down barriers between those who once lived on that plantation and those who once owned the plantation. And clearly the pioneering work of people like Rex Ellis at Colonial Williamsburg have really brought the story of slavery to the world of living history. In some ways, I think Colonial Williamsburg, even as it begins to transition itself now with its revolutionary city program, really holds some interesting possibilities in helping us think, how do we interpret this very difficult yet important past? And we could always see the array of very good museum exhibitions. The work that happened in New York, the New York Historical Society, has become really important in helping us think both how do you interpret slavery in a way that makes slavery seem more central to the lives of all of us. And yet, despite all these museums that have created exhibitions, from the Smithsonian to almost every state museum throughout the South, despite the fact that there is wonderful work to draw from in the United Kingdom and other places, I would argue that American museums, while they now no longer greet the visitor with a silence when it comes to slavery, there is no longer that deafening moment of embarrassment that says, I want to know about a story you don't have. But I would argue to you today that while there are these exciting possibilities of change, the truth of the matter is that the world of museums, the world of historic sites, has really gone through a change. But I am not convinced that the rhetoric of change matches the reality of what happens in our museums. Clearly, slavery can no longer be ignored. But I would suggest to you that the mission of interpreting slavery in American museums is still not central to most institutions. It is still seen as something important but ancillary, not central to the mission of what the institution is. And too few museums have dedicated the appropriate space and scholarship and money to make sure that the slave experience is interpreted in a way that's accessible to the broadest possible public. Too few institutions have worked hard to make sure that slavery is accessible, and most importantly, that the contemporary meaning of slavery is also made clear to the general public. And even where the change has been dramatic, even where institutions have crafted wonderfully important exhibitions, I would argue that we are really simply at that first generation of work. that generation who feels the goal is simply to acknowledge slavery, to acknowledge the African American presence. I would suggest that the time for acknowledgement is well past. I think it's so crucially important to get beyond the notion of just simply acknowledging that there were slaves and the relationship between slavery and freedom. I would argue that what is so important for us is to begin to find ways to give the public real meaning, real ownership of slavery. I've always been struck by a survey that we did at the Smithsonian in the 1990s. When we wanted to do this exhibition on slavery, the leadership of the Smithsonian said, give us data. We want to know what the public knows about slavery. So we conducted a major survey where we interviewed 5,000 Americans. And that survey brought, I thought, some really interesting statistics to bear. Now, this is an old survey, so it's the 1990s. But in the 1990s, the survey found that 84% of the white respondents felt that even though slavery may be an important story, it wasn't their story. It was an African American story. And so when this group was asked, should the Smithsonian explore slavery, the answer was yes, as a way to engage new African American audiences, not as a way to engage American audiences. Even more interesting to me was the fact that 69% of the African American surveyed, first response was, should the Smithsonian do an exhibition on slavery? 69% said it should not be one of the Smithsonian's priorities. 69%. And 48% said that the Smithsonian should not craft a major exhibition because they were embarrassed by slavery. It seems to me that when we look at what these numbers tell us, is they tell us that there was, and there still is, a strong ambivalence in America about slavery. That stems from a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding, but also a lack of understanding about the contemporary resonance of slavery. And so it seems to me that museums and historic sites have a major role to play in helping Americans come to grips with that. I'm always thinking about an interview that I did when I did the American presidency with Bill Clinton. And I asked Bill Clinton, as he wrestled with his own legacy, what was the thing that surprised him most during his career? No, it wasn't what you're thinking. But that rather, he argued that what surprised him the most was the fear that he raised when he thought about giving an apology to slavery. He said in some ways, while he expected criticism in so many of the things that he did not expect that, because as he put it, even though I'm a Southerner, I had forgotten that slavery is still alive in all of us. So I think that as I begin to think about what is it that museums are doing now and what can they do differently, let me outline for you some of the challenges I think that museums and historic sites should address if the public is to find a useful and usable past. I would argue the first challenge is the challenge of recentering slavery. Most interpretive exhibitions in museums rarely help the visitor understand just how central slavery is, to understand just how costly a shadow slavery cast over America for more than 250 years. We in this room all know how dominant slavery was when it comes to American life, how everything from political clout and economic fortune depended on the slavery. Almost every aspect of American life, from business to religion, from culture to politics, from foreign policy to culture, was shaped and reshaped by the slave experience. And the war that was the costliest in America, the Civil War, was fought over the question of slavery. And yet I would argue there are few long-term museum exhibitions or interpretive programs that convey just how important, just how dominant, just how omnipresent this institution was.